This lecture will focus on the changes to American society that happened because of the American Revolutionary War. The Americans had created something new by breaking off from this monarchy. They had created a republic. Okay, and a republic is interesting. It's not really a straight up democracy, right? It's a form of government, and it's kind of like democracy where everybody has some power, but the power is in the hands of the citizens, right? But it's not the citizens who act on the power. It's the elected officials. So they vote for someone, they vote for people who are then in charge of the country. But all of those elected officials have to go within the rules of a written down group of rules and rights for people. So a constitution. All right. So you have to write down the constitution, then you have to vote for people, and they will be the ones that run the country. All right. And so states started to write down their own constitutions at this point. They understood that it needed to be written out, but there were some people that were really afraid that we were giving too much power to the people. They definitely did not want a lot of power in the government. They did not want the government to have much power, but giving too much power to the people might set up an idea where the majority rules, and that's not really representative of all the people in the country. So one of the fears was that all of the poor people would rise up and say, oh, they're going to take away the money of the few rich people and spread it out to everybody else. And that's not something that America wanted at this point. And so John Adams said, this is a problem. It could be a problem. And so I have some ideas that will help to fix this. We need to have checks and balances. It keeps any group from becoming too strong. And to do that, they were all given powers over each other. And so he suggested the separation of powers. So to have legislative, making laws, executive, which is enforcing laws, and judicial, which is interpreting laws, keep them all separate and make sure they have those checks and balances over each other, keep those powers over each other, so nobody can have too much power. And also, he said, we need to have the legislature, we call it Congress now, okay, we need to have the legislature have two houses, a Senate, which represents the people of property, the richer people, and then an assembly to protect the common people, the poorer people. All right. And so he said these legislatures should have two houses, and that happened in almost all of our states have them. Okay. A lot of states also in their constitutions included a list of rights that the government cannot violate. This kind of set up for our Constitution, the Bill of Rights, the idea of it. And so many of these states did that to begin with. It also made it easier for men to get voting rights. We're still not in a scenario where women are going to be allowed to vote or anything like that. But some states started to say, well, we're going to let any man who pays taxes can make sure that, or can come in and vote. Others, most of the states said, we need to have people that pay taxes and that own at least some property to vote. But even this was pretty open because a lot of the people, anybody who fought in the war, was given property, was given pieces of land to make up for some of the money that they couldn't get, like we talked about before. So more men were able to vote than ever before. Freedom of religion also was an important thing in most of these states and in these constitutions. It's just, if we look at it, in Virginia, some people started to get rid of taxes so that they could support the Anglican Church, right? To get rid of all of these things. And Thomas Jefferson, in support of this, wrote something that kind of wraps up the freedom of religion idea. And he said, no man shall be compelled to support any religious worship, place, or ministry, nor shall otherwise suffer on account of his religious opinions or beliefs, but that all men shall be free to profess their opinions in matter of religion. So basically, freedom of religion. Okay, you shouldn't have to pay for other people's religion. You shouldn't be made fun of or in trouble because of your religion. And last, you should be able to say whatever you want about religion. Changes in society also started to happen when we look at kind of some of these disadvantaged groups at the time. Women, they really helped out a lot during the war. They were there, they were with the army, cooking, cleaning, doing things like that. They were also back home running farms when their husbands were out fighting. They were also enlisted, some of them as couriers, moving messages, and even spies. They would go in and infiltrate the social circles of the British generals and bring back information. And in return, what did they get? People started to look at it and say, you know, the women were really helpful during this. We should really start to advance them and make them more equal members of society. Still not close to equal, but they did get access to easier divorces. So they could, if they needed a divorce because things were not going good, it was possible for them. And then they also got access to more education. So women's schools started to be created and more girls began to have access to be able to read. The African Americans in the northern part of the country also earned a couple of different rights. A lot of them earned their freedom by fighting with the Continental Army, militias. You know, everybody, the government was saying, we really should give them their freedom if they did that, and a lot of states kind of followed that. And these ideas that had been written down about liberty, right? Liberty, freedom, equality, everybody's equal. Okay, a lot of people started to question slavery and say, is this really an okay thing for us to do? And so all across the North, laws started to be passed that would free slaves kind of slowly. When they hit a certain age, they would be free. And so this would essentially make slavery die off a slow death here. Okay, and Massachusetts was one of them who in their constitution said all people are free and equal. And so a bunch of people started to sue under this and bring it to court, and a lot of them were freed because of that line that was in the Massachusetts Constitution, right? And so there were still problems. Don't get me wrong. Things were still bad in the North for African Americans. They were only really given access to low-level, low-skilled jobs, which didn't pay very much. They were not allowed to vote, and then sometimes people would come up from the South, kidnap them, and bring them down to where the slavery was happening, and they would be put back into slavery. In the South, really, slavery only got stronger at this time because in the South, the slaves were the main workforce. They were super important because they were doing all of the work for the farmers. The leaders of the southern colonies, the southern states, really had no interest in getting rid of slavery. They wanted it to continue on so that their economies could continue to do well. Virginia was one state that the government did encourage manumission. Especially for those who fought. And manumission is it's the freeing of enslaved people, but you're not told you have to do it. It's just saying you really should free these people, but it's up to you. Okay. With manumission, 10,000 slaves were freed, mostly those who fought alongside the other people. But most of the slaves were not freed at this time. And so slavery stayed strong in the South. Take a minute to write your answer to this question. A couple other groups that had changes in their lives were the natives. The natives, really, they had two options. They were either not recognized as really helping if they had helped America. They were just kind of forgotten. And if they had become allies with the British, like the Iroquois and the Cherokee did, they had become much weaker and lost much of their power. So really, this was a very bad group of changes for the Native Americans. The Loyalists, however, remember those people that stayed loyal to Britain and thought they were going to win and stayed on their side and never became patriots, they were shunned. They were shut down. People said nasty things about them, threw things at them. It was bad by their former friends, their former neighbors, people that they had, always lived with and gotten along with and all that kind of stuff. They were completely shut down by them. In some cases, their property, their everything that they owned, their land, their houses, was seized, was taken away from them, and they were really tired of it. They didn't want to live under this new government where that was happening to them. And so about 100,000 loyalists left the country. And, some of them went to Britain, as you can see on these lines down here, okay, on this map. Okay, some went off to Britain. Some went down to these colonies in the West Indies, right? And then a bunch of them went up to British North America, which is Canada now today. Okay, so a lot of people had to leave because they had picked the wrong side, essentially. This is where we really start to talk about this culture that was made too, this American culture. And instead of all these different cultures happening, these little colonies having their own culture and not really being connected, now all of a sudden they had this event, this American Revolution, where they had all the same heroes and they had this feeling of being connected and fighting against a common enemy. And so this connected feeling and these stories and these heroes kind of brought together and made together the Americans into this one culture. And so some of the really kind of cultural giants were painters because they gave people a view of what the war was actually like. And so John Trumbull, he was an aide to George Washington during the Continental Army, and he is famous for his paintings of different events here. Okay, we can see right here the ending of the Battle of Yorktown. Okay, his painting depiction of it so that everybody could live and feel that moment and be a part of it. So you'll see a lot of John Trumbull's paintings are battles or events or things that happened during this war. And then Charles Willson Peale was another painter. He was a soldier. He had survived the winter at Valley Forge, which not all of them did. Remember, 2,000 of them died there. And he was famous for his portraits of patriot leaders. So just pictures of some of these leaders, like George Washington at the time when he was a general. That is a Charles Willson Peale painting of George Washington. And other things that happened is the culture started to be established, right? And it's built around this idea that we are different than Britain, okay? And so not only were we different, but we needed to start to educate our children differently, okay, so they wouldn't grow up to be the same as the British. We wanted them to grow up to be Americans, all right? And so we started to make these state-funded universities where each state would try to create a university where people could go and learn after they were out of school. And elementary schools also started to teach these Republican ideals of freedom and equality and all that kind of stuff, and stray away from the historical importance of the king or the queen or anything like that. This was a new government. This was a new country. We didn't want to glorify somebody else's situation. Okay, and Noah Webster saw how important this was. Okay, Noah Webster said the Americans need their own education system, and this education system needs to be built on their own culture if they want to survive and really identify and become what they want to be. And so it did things like these Republican ideals we already talked about, but another interesting thing I thought was that it standardized this American English versus British English. Okay, many of you have been to England. If not, you've seen shows and stuff like that. American and British English language are the same language. We can understand each other, but we don't all use the same words for everything. There's a difference between the two. And so we started to see English class, American English, start to come into being. So now a new culture was established. We're all hooked together, and we need to figure out how to make that work to build a new central government. And so that was kind of the focus of the Americans for a number of years following this war. Take a minute to write out 3 things that you still have questions from the notes for. If you don't have any, please try and create 3 test questions that you might see on a test or a quiz.